From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief Radio. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Rauschenbusch, broadcasting this week from New York City.
The law requires that interracial marriage and same-sex marriage must be recognized as legal in every state in the nation.
It was a bright blue sky over the White House on Wednesday as we gathered for the signing of the Respect for Marriage Act. Take a listen to me on the lawn at the White House as I reflected in the moment of how I was feeling at that historic signing of the Respect for Marriage bill. Hey everybody, talking to you from the White House. We're about to witness the signing of the Respect for Marriage Act. And I just want to share with all of our friends, our partners, all of our collaborators who work so hard to make this day happen, how happy I am, how filled with joy that we've arrived at this day where marriage equality is a reality. Just such an important moment for the whole country as a whole as we continue to expand rights and dignity for all, but also very personal for me and so many other same-sex couples as well as interracial couples who felt our full dignity was being reaffirmed yesterday by the actions of the White House and the Congress. For months, Interfaith Alliance worked in partnership with an unprecedented coalition of religious leaders and activists to demand respect for LGBTQI and interracial couples. And together, with so many others, we got it done. On this week's show, we'll be looking at the significance of this achievement and the specifics of the legislation that pertain to religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, and think about the work that lies ahead for this growing, morally driven movement for inclusion and equality. I'll talk with the Reverend Traci Blackmon, Associate General Minister of the United Church of Christ, an unwavering supporter of the Respect for Marriage Act and the communities it affirms. You'll also hear from Mary Bonauto, Senior Attorney at GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, and Katy Joseph, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Interfaith Alliance, both brilliant attorneys who helped push the Respect for Marriage Act across the finish line. Mary's been a leader in advancing the rights of LGBTQ people under the law. She was one of 3 attorneys who argued before the U.S. Supreme Court in Obergefell, arguing state bans on same-sex marriage should be ruled unconstitutional. You can hear State of Belief on the radio and get the podcast on Apple Podcasts and all other podcast platforms. Every week, I am in conversation with the most fascinating and impactful civic and religious leaders across the nation. You won't want to miss it. Please subscribe today. State of Belief Radio is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, I really want to thank you. And if you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and join in that work at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my first guests. It was essential to break down the God versus gay narrative that conservatives have been tirelessly fomenting for years. And a broad coalition of diverse faith leaders and groups did just that as they worked together for passage of the Respect for Marriage Act. The legal strategy was just as essential, especially around the religious freedom amendments that were attached to the bill. I wanted to look at the lessons learned. And there is literally nobody better to talk to about this than Mary Bonauto, Senior Attorney at GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, and my colleague Katy Joseph, Director of Policy and Advocacy at Interfaith Alliance. Mary, Katy, welcome to State of Belief Radio.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul.
So, I think we're all thawing out from yesterday being on the lawn at the White House, but this week was a historic week. It was an impressive moment, and I would love to start with both of yours just emotional resonance for the moment before we dive into kind of some of the legal and social ramifications. How did it feel to be there? Mary, why don't you start?
I I was ecstatic. And I was remembering back in 1996 when DOMA, the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, was signed by around midnight by President Clinton. And to think about this celebration of marriages and families and children and couples as, a core American value, as about right, about justice, about love, all of that was so inspiring to actually see that at this point we have harmonized technically the Supreme Court, the Congress of the United States, and the executive branch with the presidency, all saying, yeah, these marriages are here to stay and they're important and they're entitled to dignity and respect, and equality is a fundamental American value. Like, hey, it was a great day.
I love that. That is so beautiful. We're going to get into this more, but one of the things that kind of slapped me in the face when we started talking about this with Katy Joseph, I definitely want to hear from next, but was that DOMA was still on the books.
Yes.
And I was like, what? How could that be? But DOMA was still on the books. Katy, how did it feel like to you to be there?
Well, Mary used the word celebration, and I think that is the best possible way to describe the mood on the South Lawn yesterday. It was incredible to see young Gen Z activists who had flown in from Florida, who were leading the walkouts around the Don't Say Gay bill, to activists who have been working on this for quite literally decades. They're to celebrate this incredible accomplishment with families and partners and their own children and grandchildren as well. This is a major moment, and it did not come easily, and it did not come quickly. So it's really important that we are taking the time to celebrate together.
Yeah, I think I said I was there, with my husband, and we were joking. It feels like kind of a wonky rave, policy wonks, and political activists, and plain folks like us who feel like this is like our family, and that was really the moving part, and I really appreciate, Mary, what you said about the trajectory, because this has a long trajectory. And I thought that the White House actually did a really good, I was not expecting kind of an arc. I was kind of like, okay, we go, we sign, we go, say bye-bye, and they actually provided kind of a walk past, and it was so moving, for Representative Pelosi to think about when she came to the Congress and had to talk about AIDS, and then her work with marriage equality, and it's been an arc, and it was just it's so for Brad and I to be there together and to imagine our family and just feel really like it was joyful, but it was also poignant. And you think of all the families for whom this was such an important moment, and also all the families who didn't enjoy this, who maybe died at some point and were not able to recognize their partner in death, and all the families who had to lament the way that the laws were stacked against them as far as taxes and as far as all sorts of other kind of the mundane but real things of marriage. And so it felt like that extraordinary moment. What I'd love to kind of go back, because one of the reasons I wanted to talk to both of you was that this didn't kind of fall out of nowhere. This was constructed and very intentionally over a long period of time. Mary, I know you have a particular vantage point on the construction of this bill, and then also thinking through, and this is very much has to do with our work at Interfaith Alliance, the role that religion played for good and also not so good in the construction of this, and how we navigated that. Mary, could you offer us some sort of big entry into that conversation?
Yes, I'll just raise a couple of big picture points. One is with respect to this law, the Respect for Marriage Act, which was first drafted by LGBTQ and other advocates, but really under the leadership of the office of Representative Nadler. and his key staff person, Heather Sawyer, who brought us all together. And this was in the time when the Defense of Marriage Act was in effect. The federal government was actively disrespecting marriages from people in Massachusetts, for example, and then from Iowa and other states. And to remedy that, to say, like, you can't have somebody, pay into Social Security over a lifetime and then have them show up, as one of my clients did, at a Social Security office after his spouse dies and say, you don't count. You just can't do that.
What year are we talking about when you can recall with Representative Nadler?
2010.
2010. So I'm doing math. 12 years ago. That is over a decade's worth of work.
Yes. However, the bill had to be changed a lot because, this gets to your other big picture point, which is that the law has changed because of the challenges to the Defense of Marriage Act federal piece that culminated in the Windsor decision. That federal non-recognition had to go away, and the federal government did what it is supposed to do, which is respect marriages that are valid where they're celebrated. So not only did that benefit, if you will, provide the same protections to people who were married in Massachusetts or in Connecticut or in Iowa or in New York ultimately, but it also meant that people who had married in those states would be respected when they returned home to Texas, when they returned home to Arizona. And you started seeing, even though we had states that were not allowing same-sex couples to marry, you started seeing those states have to grapple with the fact that they had married same-sex couple and had to make adjustments. How you file your taxes in the state, usually follows your federal. So you got to maybe allow that now. So it was a transformative period in a lot of respects. But then Obergefell itself in 2015, obviously made a difference in terms of making marriage the law of the land for all states, regardless of their amendments or laws in place. But then the second question in Obergefell had to do with whether marriages are respected from state to state. And Obergefell said, yes, they should be. It was really tied to the marriage decision itself. But this bill does what, if I can just skip ahead for a second, because this is also about DOMA, what this bill does is has the Congress build expressly on its own power in the Constitution to say that it can prescribe by general laws the effect of acts, records, and judicial proceedings. And we have here the Congress saying, we are prescribing that the effect of a valid marriage that is valid where it is celebrated is that it will be respected by states and state governments, by the feds and the federal government and federal agencies. It doesn't reach private parties. As Senator Tammy Baldwin says, it's a humble bill, but it's also a mighty one. And it means that, at least when it comes to legal protections offered by states and responsibilities, you should be able to expect those to be in place no matter where you live.
Mary, let me, or Katy can answer this. Was the urgency around this bill triggered by Dobbs, where the threat? I mean, because the Supreme Court has already made that explicit, but then Dobbs made it seemed, if not imminent, possibly or predictably in the future, that very right that they had once granted could be grabbed away. And we saw that, of course, with Roe v. Wade. So I'm just curious, am I getting that right?
Katy, do you want to start?
Sure. So when the Supreme Court handed down the Dobbs decision that rolled back the right to access abortion as a matter of privacy, we saw in it a concurring decision written by Justice Thomas, making clear that, of course, access to abortion is not the only type of service or aspect of privacy that has been recognized by the court, and at least from Justice Thomas's perspective, should potentially be reconsidered. So we actually see within the umbrella of privacy rights, marriage, personal intimate relationships and activities, access to contraception, as well as marriage. And so this really raised an alarm bell for folks who have been working on this for a long time. We've known that Supreme Court decisions are hugely impactful, but don't exist in a vacuum, there is always the possibility that they may be revisited. And so
Well, we certainly saw, I mean, we have a very
Right.
strong case in point. And I thought, just to your point about Justice Thomas, like the fact that his decision was referenced, I think by President Biden, I mean, shows the kind of specter that created for many people who were working on this bill. I'm sorry for interrupting. I just thought that was a really interesting moment when he was quoting a Supreme Court justice as a case in point on why we needed to do this work.
And I think what's relevant here is that judicial opinions build on each other. And so there's a line of cases around the right to privacy and what that means in all these different aspects of our personal lives that built on a lot of the work that came in the years leading up to and after the Roe decision came down. And so from a legal perspective, there's a red flag that's raised when you pull out some of the foundational law that has provided the framework for all of these other things, including marriage.
And if I can just add to that briefly, even before the Dobbs concurrence, there have been statements usually issued in conjunction with dissents from the court's refusal to take a case and grant review in a case from Justices Thomas and Alito complaining bitterly about Obergefell. I mean, there's, of course, their initial dissents in Obergefell as well to point to. But this was a new level. This was coming in the context of the reversal of a fundamental right with a incredibly rigid historical analysis in which the autonomy and personal rights of women and trans and non-binary people who were pregnant counted for nothing. So this was, to have this concurrence then was a shot across the bow. It was not nothing. This was a new level. And I think it was appropriate, therefore, for the Congress to take the step it did. The law of the land remains Obergefell. Should there be any challenge, it should be rejected because Obergefell is the law of the land. And should it proceed, Obergefell was correctly decided on both liberty grounds, due process, as well as equality. So this was an opinion, Dobbs that is, that was framed up by the court as a due process, liberty, privacy decision. But I think people forget that one of the foundational cases in this area around marriage is Loving versus Virginia, which is the best named case ever, which struck down the remaining state bans on interracial marriage, which had existed at the time of the colonies in many places and continued. Virginia, as the president referenced yesterday, had a criminal law in effect. So this bill, again, I think appropriately, said we should grab this moment. This is terrifying to people. And it's not just a concern of destabilizing married same-sex couples and really LGBTQ people generally by suddenly saying you don't count anymore for purposes of equality and liberty, but also to say that when it comes to race, ethnicity, and national origin, that we are not going to tolerate discrimination in those areas either.
The Loving case is so interesting, and people are like, "Oh, come on, interracial marriage! Like, who is opposed to that?" Well, guess what? If you want to talk about originalist thinking, this. And by the way, and I want to start talking about kind of religious freedom in these questions because religion was a major instigator and promoter of like the sin of interracial marriage and the idea that, how could a society allow such a thing? And now you're kind of like, oh, come on, like that would never happen. That's within my lifetime. That's like not in the 60s, 95% of Americans thought interracial marriage was like inappropriate, if not sinful and against the law. So this is not like way back when. This is recent history. It's crazy to remember that, but it's really important that we do. Talking about religion, and also scripture was quoted in support of the bans on interracial marriage. So when people start trotting out scripture, guess what? And so I want to turn, to religion, because religion played a really important role in this because of the debates around marriage equality within certain religious traditions. I want to preface it by reminding the listeners that actually in almost every religious tradition, the support for same-sex marriage is overwhelming at this point. It's been a transformation, but it's been an overwhelming transformation. This is not, both sidesism. Actually, in many traditions, like in Judaism, it's something like 85%. It's like overwhelming. My guests are Mary Bonauto from GLBTQ, Legal Advocates and Defenders, and Interfaith Alliance's Katy Joseph. Religion still played an really important, I was going to say outsized, but that's whatever. That's, an important role in this. And so there was I'm going to say it wrong, so you guys will both jump in and correct me, a Religious Freedom Amendment. Do I have that right? Or Religious Liberty Amendment or something? Well, Mary, maybe you can just walk us down that path a little bit and talk about why that was necessary and some of what you saw as the important elements of that also allowed for this humble but potent, I love that, I hadn't heard that by Senator Baldwin, potent bill to move forward.
So here's the thing that's important to remember about this bill, and it helps to tee up the religious issues as well. This is really a status quo bill. We have Obergefell and Windsor, and under those decisions, the states and the federal government have to respect marriages. That was what the Congress was trying to concretize and did. That's what the House did. However, when it went to the Senate, a number of different religious liberty advocates and faiths themselves engaged the process. At that point, amendments started coming forward to get to the 60 votes that you need. Maybe that's some Democrats too, but definitely to get Republicans, quote unquote, religious liberty had to be protected. Then the question is, what does that mean? And I believe that the needle that Senator Baldwin, Senator Collins, and others were trying to thread was to keep this a status quo bill, to not provide new advantages to, quote unquote, either side in the so-called culture wars. Okay, so that really informs everything. However, I want to say that the way I understand some of the process is that there are people I don't feel like I'm anti-religious liberty. I'm just going to say that, okay? But people on the other side of this, advocacy side of this, who are really afraid and experience legal respect for LGBTQ people as an existential threat. And so how do you guard against that? And so honestly, some of it is as simple as saying, as this law does, that federal constitutional and statutory protections for religious liberty remain what they are, whatever they may be. Okay. So that's there. There's a finding. Okay. This again was something that all of these were requested by other people, not by Senator Baldwin, for example. A finding that, sort of quoting Obergefell, that there are the people who have diverse beliefs about the role of gender in marriage are decent and honorable people, and their beliefs deserve respect. But that doesn't really help anybody. It just says everybody's opinions are decent and honorable. Okay. And then goes on.
So was that actually part of an amendment that was actually
Correct.
in?
Correct.
That's really interesting. I don't think I knew that was like, we're good people. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost plaintive. It's like, okay, correct me if I'm wrong. I know I'm stepping over. By the way, I do want to say very quickly, you do not have to question the people who are saying religious liberty, and doing this, because we're a religious freedom organization at Interfaith Alliance, and we believe in inclusive religious freedom for everyone. And we're not anti-religious freedom. We're just trying to find the right way that it can function in society that gives dignity to everyone. So your questions around this are totally valid.
Okay, so you have the findings, and the findings go on to say that millions of same-sex and interracial and interethnic couples have married and they deserve the stability, the respect that marriage provides for them and their families and their children. So, so it's acknowledging people. And then we have the First Amendment piece, and the constitutional protections, and they are what they are. But then we get into some other measures, okay? And I want to talk about those. So one is something that's confused a certain number of people. And it says that nothing in the Respect for Marriage Act. And again, what is the Respect for Marriage Act? It's about how the states, the federal government, agencies have to respond to people who are married, okay? So nothing in that applies to tax exempt statuses and contracts and grants and so on that don't come around that are not related to a marriage. So it's just saying like this, when it comes to like, those things are for a different day. Those conversations and debates are going on about the proper reach of non-discrimination laws insofar as people experience them as interfering with their free exercise rights. Those will all happen. RMA does not affect them. So there's that.
Yeah.
But then there's the last piece that I would like to mention, which is this, and it is something that I'm seeing some people begin to write about. And it's a piece that says, it uses a definition of religious organization that comes from the IRS, from the tax code. And it says religious organizations, and then they spell it out to some degree, houses of worship, religious educational institutions, other religious nonprofits, shall not be required to provide services for, or their employees don't have to engage in solemnization of a marriage or celebration of a marriage. So we have something that is limited to certain defined religious organizations already acknowledged as such by the IRS. They don't have to participate in solemnization. My point has always been like, whoever said they would have to be. I mean, that is protected. I don't think anybody who knows about the law really expects otherwise. I'm sure somebody will disagree now that I've said that. But, I mean, that is protected. And why would we want to have that fight?
Yeah.
So that's one piece.
Yeah.
The second piece is the celebration piece. And that is an area where I have to say it's partly about 60 votes. Again, what are we talking about when we're talking about the celebration of the marriage, the party after the solemnization? I think what it means, and we've confronted this in states, including in states where I work, where to get a marriage law passed in a state, like in Maine, we had to say, our public accommodations law is not going to apply to a house of worship or its appurtenant buildings if they rent them out. It's not going to apply when it comes to who they're going to rent to. And this bill sort of says the same thing. Just to
when we talk about celebration, we're talking about a
the
space.
Party after the marriage.
Yeah.
Parish hall.
I got you.
The parish hall.
Yeah.
And I would. So again, just because you can discriminate or you can exclude doesn't mean you have to, right? So I'd like to think that if you're the parish hall, that's the only appropriate venue for any decent sized celebration within 50 miles. You might figure out a way to help people out, but this would say you don't have to. That's how this reads.
Yeah, some people are upset about that. Katy, how do you? I mean, it sounds like that's not changing anything, but how do you read that part of the law?
I think the characterization of this bill as a status quo bill is entirely appropriate. I think that over the course of time, we've seen how laws like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, have been used in ways that they were not originally intended when they were passed. But it is important to still, in a bill like this being signed in 2022, to reference and affirm existing protections under federal law without going further. I think that, Mary, you're entirely right that if there's a spot in this bill where some questions may be asked, and of course, no bill is going to answer every question. That's part of why lawyers have the jobs that we do. But if there's any place in this bill that might raise questions, it's around what celebration might mean. But I will say two things about the way that the bill was slightly amended. in the Senate. It makes really clear that we're talking about rights arising out of a marriage. That's kind of legal magic words, but it gets to just how narrow this bill really is in practice. So when we're potentially going to see nonprofits attempt to push a license to discriminate and even mischaracterize what this bill does, it's written right there in very clear language. We're talking about rights related to the status of a legal marriage alone, not all this other stuff, whether it's about who you'll serve in your bakery or your web design business or whatever else. That's not what we're getting into. We're talking about rights arising out of a marriage, and that makes a difference once that marriage has been solemnized. The other piece that I do want to, if it's okay, circle back to is that language in the findings about decent and I'm trying to remember exactly what the quote is around respect for diverse beliefs. Depending on who's reading that, it's kind of a Rorschach test. People are going to see what they want there. But I think for folks who are people of faith, who affirm LGBTQ folks, who see the option of marriage for those who see it as having meaning for them and their spouse, it's really valuable to see in a law recognition that iteration of faith, of being a religious person who believes in marriage equality, is deserving of respect. Because so often we hear from the religious right that the quote unquote right way to be a person of faith maps onto a political worldview that stands in opposition to LGBTQ equality. And that just doesn't ring true.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So the way that's exactly the opposite of the way I heard that. And I think in part because the National Association of Evangelicals, in their statement of coming out in support, used almost identical language to talk about why they opposed it. So when I heard Mary mention that was part of the bill to support it, I was thinking, oh, that was like a carve out in order to say it's okay, and so it's really interesting. Both sides really want to cling on to that language, that this is a legitimate point of view. And actually, honestly, I'm fine. Think whatever you want to think. Pray however you want to pray. That is exactly the definition of freedom of religion. Go for it. But then when it gets reflected in our laws and affects other people outside of your faith tradition, that's when I start to like bristle and say, well, you don't get to speak for everybody. You don't get to say the faith voice is, because that's it's a sentence that's impossible to complete. And be authentic and honest. So this is, I thank you for that correction, because the way I heard Mary talk about it, I thought that was something that was insisted upon by what?
It was.
That's so interesting. And so everybody's using it the same, and so they wanted that in there for their purposes. And I'm preferring to think of it in terms of the way you described it, Katy, which is also like on all sides. It's fine and right and honestly, I don't know. I want to move us to the future, because for my nephews and nieces who have never grown up with anything but seeing me and my husband together, the idea that this is a question mark is like, they're just like, what? Like, what are we even talking about? Why are we having this conversation? For Brad, who's and my generation, the idea that this is, it's a miracle almost. It wasn't even something that was a thought for me growing up. And for Brad, with his earlier partner who died of AIDS, like they never even talked in terms of marriage, because it was like it wasn't even an abstraction. It was like an illusion. And so we're in a shift, and it's only going to go one way. There's almost no way it can go. It can't go back. But let's think about going forward. And we've taken up so much of both of your time, but I just want to just what's your first thought about the way this bill dealt with religious freedom issues. Like, what can we learn from it going forward writ large for our society? And I know that's an enormous question, but I just want to hear what your first thoughts on, because what I'm determined to work with coalitions across the board is like religious freedom can no longer be the first thought of religious freedom should not be that how can I discriminate? And that just feels really important to me. But I also like, I know that's so subjective, all that kind of stuff. But how do you understand the interplay between a law and religious freedom that can help us move forward and allow people to believe what they believe and think what they think, but also not use it as a bludgeon against others? Mary, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I'm going to continue to reflect on this because it's obviously not every day that we see a law like this pass the Congress. So it's a very important question. So I have two thoughts. One is Professor Doug Laycock, who, incredibly respected religious liberty scholar, joined with some others to support the Respect for Marriage Act. And in that letter acknowledged that our nation is not at a place where you can just say religious liberty always wins. We always be in that camp, whatever that may be, always get what we want, as though there are no other rights involved and no other people and no other interests. That in fact, we are dealing with two crucial interests, and that this bill was a path forward for acknowledging both of those interests. There are people, of course, who disagree vehemently, who feel like this is a Trojan horse. It doesn't protect religious liberty, et cetera, but it acknowledges the concerns. It acknowledges the state of the law. Again, the status quo bill piece. And thinking about it a little further, this is not a new thought, but it feels newly invigorated, is that whole line about, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. And so when I see the National Association of Evangelicals and, the Union of Orthodox Judaism, if I'm saying that correctly, and the LDS Church saying, we want to respect the law and our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and we also want to have our right to have the marriages that we will solemnize in our faith, I start feeling the Caesar God thing going on. And I don't know how far that would go, but I am very intrigued by that possibility. And again, to the extent that this bill helped people to feel reassured that this bill was not going to be used to pose that existential threat, then fantastic. I'm not sure how much of a model that is going forward, but that's exactly what I want to think about.
You just gave me the sermon that I need to write, and I'm going to give you proper credit. I'm a preacher. And so I think that I've actually that has been a scripture passage that I've been wondering, could that be teased out? So thank you for offering that question. We can live in a society and figure out how to be our, even when we conflict, we need to understand we're living in a society, and how can we not fray our society completely because of our religious beliefs? Katy, can you bring us home here? Solve all the problems now with your statement, please.
I'll echo Mary. Interfaith Alliance works on an inclusive vision of religious freedom, and in all of the work that we do, we're conscious that freedom of belief is one right in a larger constellation of rights that are protected under the Constitution. And so the ability to hold the religious views that you do, or the non-religious views that you do, for plenty of secular folks, freedom of belief is crucially important. It requires that all of us respect the ability of others to do the same. And I think in the process and moving the Respect for Marriage Act forward, we saw some of this play out in real time. We saw these much more far-reaching amendments that would have taken the bill off course and turned it into something quite different, frankly fail. And we saw members, what I would consider far-right members of the Senate attempt to push their colleagues to sign on to their view of what religious freedom means, and they didn't get very far. So if we need a moment of encouragement through this process, even though some amendments were necessary to get this across the finish line, ultimately, the view of the religious right of those far-right members of the Senate who wanted to enshrine religious freedom as a license to discriminate under the banner of this law, they were not successful. It was the very broad coalition of LGBTQ equality advocates, faith-based advocates, business leaders, and so many more who saw this as a question of equal treatment under the law and a way to respect the essential rights and dignity of all of us to exist in public life, under the banner of respect for marriage in federal law. So this is a really big win for folks who have been working on this for a long time, and also for those of us who are thinking ahead about what religious freedom might look like within the larger context of constitutional protections going forward.
Yeah, and I just before we end, I just want to acknowledge, Katy, all of your amazing work in organizing faith groups, huge array of faith groups. I think we had, literally in the end, hundreds of faith groups sign on to letters in order to say, no, you're not going to speak for the faith community when you come at it from that angle. In fact, we represent millions and millions and millions of people from across faith groups, and acknowledging that, with the work of others, with, we brought new people into that coalition of people saying, like, this is not going to be who we are going forward. So, Katy, I want to thank you on behalf of everybody on that day for the important role you played, and that all of us, that this was a group effort. And Mary, so much gratitude for all of your work in this over decades and decades, and we appreciate it. Mary Bonauto is Senior Attorney at LGBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders. Katy Joseph is Director of Policy and Advocacy at Interfaith Alliance. Thank you both so much for all of your work and for being with us here today on State of Belief Radio.
Thank you so much. What a joy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Up next, the Reverend Traci Blackmon, Associate General Minister of the United Church of Christ. And later, more clergy reactions to the passage of the Respect for Marriage Act. You'll hear the thoughts of Father James Martin. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of State of Belief anytime on our website. You'll also find links to the topics we discussed this week, extended interviews and transcript, and an archive of past shows, all at stateofbelief.com. You're listening to State of Belief Radio, made for a time such as this. The Reverend Traci Blackmon is Associate General Minister for Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ. She is a deeply spiritual leader who brings faith to bear on issues of social justice and dignity for all people. She is someone who I have admired from afar and had the fortune to be close to on certain occasions. And Traci, I just want to welcome you to State of Belief and thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you have such an extraordinary history of living at the intersection of faith and justice. And I was wondering if you could just give our listeners a little bit of information about your backstory, where you come from, how you come to this kind of extraordinary place of witness that you embody today.
Well, sure. That's a loaded question. I am a pastor, and I served people who live predominantly on the margins of society, whether that be because of race or sexuality or economics. And so that has always been the context from which I live and speak. And when you serve in such places, there are always crises and always traumas that have to be attended to. And I come to this work from the pastoral position of attending to those. So for me, that means not only being the prophetic, but the priestly, depends on what is needed in the moment. And serving in that way positioned me to be a community voice when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson. I was doing this kind of work before that in different ways, mobilizing people to the polls and making sure that we did our part to increase access to food and to clothes and to things other people needed prior to that. But that particular killing kind of catapulted me into a different platform. Yeah. Just because I was in the streets there. So that's where most people know me from, but it really has been my life, all my life.
Right. That doesn't happen overnight. I mean, yeah. I remember I was at Huffington Post at that time, and I was interested in the religious response to the killing of Michael Brown, and and your name kept on coming up. Like, this is the person who's doing the work. She may not be able to talk to you right now because she's actually doing the work, and you may not be able to get to her. But it wasn't because you came to prominence at that time. It's because you were already there and trusted, and people turned to you. And I just think it's an important story, but it's also, as you say, that just introduced more people to you. You were already there and doing that work, and now you are a national voice, and we're grateful to you. You mentioned sexual orientation and the kind of marginal communities that you've been a part of. One thing that we're talking about today is the Respect for Marriage Act, and the important, critical role that religious voices played in the passage of this act. And the United Church of Christ, where you are in a leadership role, played an instrumental role in that. And we were at Interfaith Alliance very proud and honored to work alongside the United Church of Christ to make sure that the religious voice wasn't the one that people normally associate. Oh, it's religion versus the gays, or something like that. Instead, people like yourself and many, many others have said, no, that's a false binary here. I'm just wondering how you're feeling today as you think about the passage of the act and some of what it means for the United Church of Christ and for people you serve.
Yes, and I want to thank you for your partnership on that. That was very helpful to us as well. The United Church of Christ, we understand God to be creator of all humankind. And in that role, we understand all human beings to be created in the image of God. And so for us, this is not merely a position or a stance about this law. It is about the dignity and the humanity of all humankind. And we've been on this side for a long time. In that regard, the Respecting of Marriage Act certainly was critical in protecting the rights of same-gender loving couples, and yet it still doesn't go far enough, right? So it moves us to a place of being able to say that if someone is married, that they would be protected. But quite frankly, if we talk honestly, in this moment, the decisions of this Supreme Court have been very frightening in a lot of areas, and LGBTQ rights is not left out of that frightening context. And so we're positioned for the next round of battle, quite frankly. We celebrate this. Grateful to have so many UCC ministers on the ground. Some of them were invited to the White House to witness the signing of the act. And certainly we want to take this moment and breathe and say, celebrate. But we don't want to be so busy celebrating that we lose sight of what is really in front of us. What this Respect for Marriage Act does is say that if someone is married, you have to honor that, right? But this Supreme Court is also having little ruminations of coming after marriage equality in a larger way, which would mean that federally marriages that exist would be protected. But in states like Missouri, where I live, people would not be able to marry whom they love. And how tragic is that, right? With all the things that we could be, climate justice and taking care of the poor, with all the things we could be focusing on, that we would try to prohibit people from marrying the people that they love and receiving the benefits and the rights of marriage that are given to everyone else is really a tragic commentary on us as human beings and on us as a nation right now. And I'm celebrating, but I'm also calling that out.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I wonder if you, like, part of what the language that at Interfaith Alliance, one of the language pieces that we want to, what does religious freedom mean? I mean, there's been for the last, too long, people have meant, religious freedom, that gives me the right to, say whatever I want, to do whatever I want, as far as I say it's because of my faith. And I'm just wondering, like, for me, religious freedom, yes, you can actually believe whatever you want, and you can even say whatever you want, but you should not be able to do whatever you want when it infringes on the dignity of others. It's meant to, religious freedom should be used as, a bridge, not a bludgeon, and what we're seeing is, so I want to flip that script. I would love to hear how you think of religious freedom and what that means for the UCC.
Yes. So thank you for that question, Paul. I mean, there has to be a consideration that one's freedom has boundaries when it begins to put other people in bondage, correct? So you are free to believe whatever you want to believe. You're just not free to make me comply with whatever you believe. That's the boundary of religious freedom. And I would suggest that anyone who uses scripture as a basis has a difficult time challenging that, because God's self does not even force people to do things or force people to believe things, even in scripture, right? And so it is not about trying to change what you believe, although I think what you believe is grossly misinterpreted and wrong. It is about preventing you from imposing your religious beliefs on me, right? And whether that's marriage equality, whether that's abortion rights, whether that's trans rights, you don't get to say that your understanding of God should be applied to my life. And my concern with this Supreme Court is that they are making decisions now based on their religious beliefs, which for me invalidates the court altogether, right? Absolutely removes from them this standard of respect and honor that should be afforded the Supreme Court as a place of just deliberations, right?
Right.
And they're not hiding it.
Yeah,
so,
it feels like it's become an arm for a thin slice of American religious belief that is being able to be imposed on the rest of us. Which is in some ways like the definition of an unfortunate theocratic leaning. And so I appreciate exactly you calling that out. I want to also would love to hear some of the priorities of the United Church of Christ as you look forward to 2023, as we think about going into the future. You mentioned climate change. The UCC has been leading in so many important ways, especially under your leadership. And I would just love to hear some of the things that you're thinking about going forward, where we should be putting our efforts as people of faith, as people who, or people who maybe don't have faith but moral conscience and who want to be moving our country and our world in the right direction. Where do you think we should be putting our energies, and what is the United Church of Christ thinking in those terms?
Well, a primary focus of the United Church of Christ work remains racial justice. We believe, and I think rightfully so, that many of the issues that we face in this country have roots in racism. You could say in white supremacy, but it's really more than that. It's about the disrespect and the disregard of non-white persons in this country. And so that for us is global work, not just national work. We will continue our work to help refugees and those who have been displaced. We'll continue our work to try to call into view a rewriting, rewriting and rerighting, a rewriting of history as people are trying to ban books and stop stories from being told. So racism is central to us, and racism is central to us not just from a prophetic standpoint, but from an introspective repentance and repair standpoint. So we're also trying to do that work, right? Of acknowledging that the church has often been the chief colonizer in places, not just around Black and white, but also with indigenous people, right? And so that will remain a focus of our work. Climate justice is really crucial for us. I read this T-shirt once, and I've been threatening to make them over again, that says, "There is no planet B." Right? There is no planet B.
I love that. Yes. Yeah.
So if we don't get this right, then all the other things are going to pale in comparison. And it is undeniable the greed and the disregard we've had for our call to be good stewards over this creation, and what that means for our children and our children's children is critically important. So we continue our work in that way. As you may know, the United Church of Christ is the denomination from which the term environmental racism came, and we continue to do studies and work in that regard. We just instituted some environmental justice fellows from younger people who can help us all through the nation amplify this cry for paying attention to justice. And with the new legislation that allows for solar panels, we are working really hard to try to help our churches take advantage of that as well. So race and climate justice are huge. And at this intersection that you already mentioned before is always economics, right? So we have not raised the minimum wage in this country since 2009. And everything else has increased, but not the minimum wage. And there comes a point where people cannot live on what they are making in this country. And that, I would suggest, plays into our issues of unhoused people, plays into our issues with not being able to find adequate workers. And if you ever doubted that that was an issue, just look at what happened during COVID when people began to get relief checks, right? It actually was more beneficial for so many workers to not work at all and get the relief check than to go to work every day, right?
Right.
So economic justice is really big for us, especially as neighborhoods are the cost of living in neighborhoods is outpacing many of the residents there. They're being forced out. Right. I would say these are our three major issues. Of course, Roe v. Wade is huge for us. The United Church of Christ was advocating for abortion access and abortion rights before Roe v. Wade. Right. And so this has been really a blow to see women's bodily autonomy under attack again, under attack at a time when we actually have generations who've not known life outside of Roe. This now have to contend with that. Right. So these are the areas we're focusing.
Yeah, and one of the things you said at the top, and I want to bring it back around, is that none of this is removed from the kind of pastoral work that the UCC Church does. It's because people this is what affects people's lives. And if the church is going to be about anything, it's going to be about people's lives. These are their whole lives. And you can't just say, oh, well, we're going to deal with the spirit and good luck here. It's about the whole life. It's about what, and it's about the whole body, the community. It's not individualistic. It's the community. And so these issues are all come back to how we live our lives in a more beautiful, just way in community with one another. And I just think like the mix between the spiritual, the pastoral, the prophetic is what, I think is really just something I identify with you as a leader and as someone who has exemplified this so much. So I want to thank you as a fellow traveler with Jesus, and also as someone, a fellow citizen of this country who just really appreciates all you're doing for all of us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I also want to say that it's also about doing this work with humility, understanding that we don't know everything there is to know about God. No one person does. And to presume that we know the mind of God about issues that are facing us is a very dangerous position to take, right? And so it's about humility. You mentioned earlier that people already trusted me, but the other part of that is that I trusted them. I trusted them to know what was best for their lives. I trusted them to know who they love. I trusted them to know who they are, right? And so when you trust people with their own lives, then you get a broader understanding and expansive view of God. I don't get to define other people. And that's not the call of ministry, and that's not the call of church. The call of church is to open and welcome everyone into a sense of belonging. And sometimes we get confused by that because we think we are actually empowered to decide who's welcome or not. But it's not that. It is that we are called to declare what is already so, that you are already welcomed. You already belong, right? You're already welcomed because we are all here by God's grace. And so I'm so grateful for the work that you and your organization is doing. And I have much hope that we will be successful in maintaining safety and security and belonging for LGBTQ people, particularly the attacks on our trans children. That's really keeping us up at night. And for all the other issues we have to face together.
The Reverend Traci Blackmon is Associate General Minister of the United Church of Christ. The denomination has been a strong supporter of the Respect for Marriage Act. Reverend Blackmon, thank you so much for being with us here on State of Belief Radio.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Coming up on New Year's weekend, you'll hear an in-depth conversation with Father James Martin, a prophetic Catholic voice on inclusivity and respect for all people in the life of the church, and one of the most spiritual leaders I know. Getting together to record that interview this week, I asked Father Jim for his reactions to the signing of the Respect for Marriage Act just the day before. I wanted to include his timely remarks on this week's State of Belief Radio. The signing of the Respect for Marriage Act, I'm just curious how you, as a person who works with a lot of people who have same-sex relationships, and how that landed with you.
I think for a lot of LGBTQ people, as you know, it was a source of joy, but more, I think, a source of relief. There were a lot of same-sex couples who I knew who were really worried about some of, I guess it was Justice Thomas's comments in Dobbs, I suppose. I'm not a legal scholar. And I had a friend who was thinking of leaving the country because he was so upset. So I think really relief Is how it landed with a lot of the people I know. What about you? What was your response?
Absolutely. I mean, relief was absolutely the way Brad and I experienced this. I'm just curious. Obviously, the Catholic Church is not going to be acknowledging same-sex couples, and I think what was good about is that there was space for people to have their own beliefs and their own practices. I'm sure you're not able to perform same-sex marriages, but I know that people who are in relationships with you feel your love and support. How are you able to convey that love and support in a way that obviously doesn't break your responsibilities as a priest in the church, but offers them that kind of support?
What a great question. I think by recognizing the love that exists between them, I think that's the most important thing. I have a lot of friends who are married gay couples, and you included. And one of the things I like to share with people who might be suspect of those relationships is just stories about gay couples. I often tell the story of a gay couple I knew. The fellow's name was Carlos. He was a Eucharistic minister, a lector, a spiritual director, and a hospital chaplain at Sloan Kettering here in New York City. And he was with his partner Jim for years and years. Carlos got sick with cancer, and Jim cared for him for years through surgeries and radiation and chemo and all this. And I say to people, is that love, right? Is that a form of love? And it's very hard for people not to say, yes, it's a form of love. So I think one of the things I like to do is just to reveal that to people, people in the church especially, and say, we need to look at this as love, and we need to consider this as love. And, and some people, particularly in Germany and Western Europe, are saying we need to recognize it as love, right? Bless these same-sex
within
unions.
Within the church.
Yeah, I mean,
within the Catholic Church.
That's true. There's some sort of stuff going on in Germany in particular, where the German bishops are talking about possibilities of recognizing or blessing same-sex unions. Now, this gets into kind of technical Catholic stuff, but the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith has said that that's not permissible. But in this run-up to what's called a synod, this kind of worldwide meeting of the church, there are a lot of people that are asking for that. And so, we'll see where that conversation goes.
I just, I want to get into some other topics, but I do want to recognize right now the role that you play in allowing people who are so deeply committed to their Catholic faith and Catholic tradition, and you're giving them space. Now, obviously, you're not, performing marriages, but you're giving them space to feel like someone like you, who has such standing in the church, is also recognizing their love. I just feel like that's really, it's a beautiful stance. It's a brave stance, and I'm sure it is life-giving to the countless couples that you know.
I hope so, and I hope it's also just recognizing LGBTQ people as the beloved children of God that they are. So, even deeper than people are in relationships, just saying that these people are loved by God and are fully part of the church and really need to be listened to. That's one of the things I really try to encourage Catholic leaders to do, is to just listen to their experiences rather than thinking of them as categories or stereotypes. And, Paul, as you know, we've known each other for a long time. This is a relatively new ministry for me, only about 5 or 6 years old. And so, I'm careful not to challenge any church teaching, but within those boundaries to say that we need to listen to their experiences and treat them as people, through whom God is working. What is God revealing to us through the LGBTQ community now? And I think it's quite a bit.
That is a really beautiful thing, and it's really important to mention in the context of the passing of the Respect for Marriage Act that, as you say, offered relief and a sense of full dignity to so many of us, myself included. So I really appreciate those comments. And with that, I'm afraid that's all the time we've got for this week's show. We need your help keeping this show on the air, and I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And you can also be part of making sure informative and encouraging voices like these are heard by sharing this program with friends and family. Let's get more people listening and more people taking part in these conversations, both on and off the air. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the weekly State of Belief podcast on Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast platform. And join the conversation. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at State of Belief and share State of Belief with the people in your life. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Rauschenbusch, and that's State of Belief.
I think it's time we stop. Children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.